It's one of the most difficult questions to answer because there was a very good quote from a technology journalist who said, SDN is not a technology, it's a use case. And what he meant by that is that SDN kind of sprang out of the universities a few years ago because they basically wanted to pull apart the switches that they were using so they could get at the software that was inside the switch. Normally that's all locked away by the manufacturers, but they wanted an open platform for that control plane software. And they started to develop enterprise networks based on switches that had the brains ripped out of them, and you actually put the brains in a central computer somewhere in the network. So now you fast forward to the problem that data center operators are having. There are some real challenges that they face that could be solved with a centralized control plane like an SDN control plane. But all of those protocols have to be battle hardened for data center use. Google, Microsoft, guys like that, they've all led that development to battle harden the protocols of SDN in the data center. So now the third kind of tidal wave is coming now. It's when we move SDN protocols into the transport networks. So in other words, the backbones of the internet, where we can solve some problems such as end-to-end provisioning through different technology layers using SDN type protocols. So that's why I say it's a use case really. Depending on which of those use cases you're focused on, SDN will be different things to you. They wouldn't be involved in that kind of technology if there weren't financial benefits. So those benefits either come in terms of lower equipment costs or lower operational costs in the network. There's only ever those two different variables that you play with when it comes to financial benefits. If you look at John Chambers of Cisco, he recently commented that white box switches and the SDN control planes that drive them are probably the biggest threat to Cisco's business at the moment, the biggest competitor that they have. So the idea would be that instead of paying for very, very expensive proprietary routers, you actually have low-cost Ethernet switches that are driven by one of these very intelligent centralized control planes. And that can transform the economics for an enterprise network or for the internet service provider portion of the network. What we expect to see is a similar kind of revolution in the data center as well. So yeah, absolutely, there could be some real transformational economics brought around by SDN. In theory, it could. If you look at what's the biggest consumer of energy in a telecoms network, we have this shock horror statistic that telecoms networks consume 2%, or they generate 2% of the world's carbon emissions, I think is the statistic. The thing is that's a gross statistic. In other words, it's all kinds of telecoms. But then you look at the different aspects of telecoms, data centers. Data centers are very processor intensive, whether it's compute power or its storage power. Router networks, the IP portion of the network, is a big consumer per megabit per second of data moved. As you move down the stack towards the transport network, towards the optical transmission network, the power consumption drops dramatically. So the question to ask is, would there be a way to use SDN to move some of the traffic from moving through the IP portion of the network, which is a high power consumer per megabit per second, down to the lower portions of the network, which is a lower power consumer in the network? So if the answer is yes for SDN, then clearly it's a technology that can save us power. And it's certainly a direction that Infinera is pushing at the moment for what we call carrier SDN. Remember earlier I mentioned the different use cases for SDN. As you adapt to the different use cases, you actually change the protocols. You battle harden them, you make them more secure, you make them more robust. And carrier SDN is a very robust version of SDN. It's a carrier-friendly version of SDN with security built in, scalability built in, that would allow us to deploy SDN in carrier networks. They have to be extremely reliable and they have to be very manageable. The move towards SDN has the potential for one of the biggest disruptions in networking in recent years. And that's really because of the opportunity to move traffic away from highly proprietary routers, which is the router industry is almost a closed shop. There's only one or two companies that dominate that industry, and that's why the prices in that industry tend to be very high. The margins for those companies tend to be very, very high because there isn't very much competition. If you could break that duopoly or triopoly, it depends who you consider in that market, then potentially you can give the consumer more choice. So one way to do that would be to move towards the white branded approach that I mentioned earlier and help customers lower costs.
Do you think this